911 yesterday. Got some game emergency. You need to hurry up, come in here. My son said somebody murdered in the room.
It's a heinous crime. It's as violent as you could be.
When I get to the room, I seen like dry blood.
We know we're gonna get absolute facts if the image is captured.
What's he holding?
That's a shotgun.
He has a pistol grip shotgun in his hand.
That monster gave no thought to the loss.
We're really against the clock.
This individual has to be identified and quickly.
Hey, we're here.
Hey, Dion.
Dion worked as a youth coordinator at a substance abuse treatment program. I was Dion's supervisor. All of the young people that were employed at the Kids Safe Zone had backgrounds very similar to the children that we were serving.
There you go, Superman.
Dion had his bout with substance use and unemployment and undereducation and the other things that plagued that community. He was serious about recovery and changing the way that he lived.
This is for you. What is that right there?
And he asked on several occasions if we could consider him working with us because of the amount of times that he had come through the program and was familiar with everyone. It was a perfect fit. It was impossible to be in his space and not smile. And he walked into the door, the kids would light up. I don't think I've ever seen Dion any happier than when he was working with the children.
Why? That's right. I think he paid them. Did you pay those children?
His most important role was that of a father. He had a set of twins and an older child. But he wanted to be a dad that provided things that kids wanted. He wanted his kids to have some of the things that he didn't have.
I don't know nobody that's thinking all the time about their kids. If he had free time, it was free time for his kids. Dion wanted to do the right thing. He was transitioning into a better person.
Hey, catch you later.
See you later.
You too, dummy.
Future was looking very bright for Dion.
This Baltimore City 911 yesterday. Got some game emergency. You need to hurry up, come in here. My son said somebody murdered in the room. Hello? Man? Oh my God. I am so scared right now. Oh my God. Dion! Oh my God. It's blood. Blood everywhere. Do it look like you've been shot, man? Yeah.
On July 2nd, 2017, at approximately 7:35 p.m., a call was made to the fire department from Argyle Avenue. Initial information stated that a man was on the floor bleeding and not breathing.
The Baltimore City Fire Department immediately dispatched medical personnel to the scene.
Baltimore PD also sends an officer.
Upon entering the first floor front bedroom, the officer located the body of an adult male with a gunshot wound to the head.
Medical staff quickly assessed that the victim had deceased. Our patrol division right away knew that this was going to be a call for the homicide unit, and that's when we were notified.
Upon entering the victim's room, I noticed the room to be in disarray. I noticed the victim to be laying on the ground on his back. He was wearing tan shorts, a white t-shirt, and tennis shoes. He had blood around his head, blood spatter around him. The wound on the side of the victim's head indicated that it was a large caliber gun. There was no cell phone, there was no murder weapon, so there really wasn't a lot of evidence within this room.
It almost looked like there were signs of a struggle. The interior of the residence was a little messy. He was near a couch that had been pulled away from the wall, and in his hand he had some money. Maybe it was a robbery gone bad, or maybe somebody tried to burglarize his residence, but it was odd that he had money in his hand. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no damage to the front door, the door jamb. So this was possibly somebody that either lived there or was, the victim was comfortable with.
Located inside the room was the victim's backpack and wallet with his identification inside.
We got ID. The ID belongs to 25-year-old Dion Smith.
So we need to notify next of kin. That's a priority for us. It's going to be emotional. Their loved one is now deceased, and not just deceased, but been murdered.
Hello? I remember getting a call and being told Dion was gone. And what? I remember my breath being taken away. Just been thinking our city and the violence, and now it was this close to home.
Everything that I was dreaming of at that time shattered.
We'd watched Dion grow up, and we'd watched him finally come into who he wanted to be, and then to think that Dion's gone means that his kids won't ever see him again. It's senseless. It was so special, and such a sweet, kind soul gone.
It's critically important for us to find witnesses that might talk to the police right after the incident occurred.
Paulette Richardson, one of the residents, provided information about what had occurred earlier.
I'm a detective and I'm assigned to the homicide unit. I'm here to speak to you in reference to a death that one of my partners is out investigating at Argyle Avenue.
Paulette was inside her room. We're on the second floor, and her son, Dexter, ran into her bedroom screaming, "Call the police."
And I'm like, why? He like, some guy, he said Dion is dead. And I'm like, what you mean? He said he did.
At that time, Paulette Richardson called 911. Although she didn't witness the incident, she was still nervous as to any repercussions about giving information to the police.
People are very reluctant to come forward and talk to the police because there's an element of danger there. There might be some retaliation that they may experience from the bad guys.
But that's too much information. Never mind. Talk to me. No. Talk to me. No, wait a minute. No.
There's a phrase in Baltimore, snitches get stitches.
What's your first name again? Dexter Richardson Jr.
Paulette's son Dexter was brought into the homicide office and interviewed.
I wake up around like 7, took a shower. That's when my mother and her friend knocked on my door, gave me my $8. And at that point, I said, "Where everybody at?" She said she don't know. She went upstairs.
Dexter comes out of his room and notices that Dion's door is open.
So I peeped in the room, and when I peeped in the room, I seen like dried blood on the floor. Like I didn't peep really around that. I seen his arm.
Dexter tells us that while he's discovered the body, he hears a tap at the window.
He went around to the front door and opened the door, and a man wearing a gray t-shirt entered the dwelling.
He the type of person I wouldn't hang with. Like, look dirty. Junkie? No, not like haircut, not cut. Like, Just one of them people you be like, nah, I ain't sketchy. You just kind of uneasy around.
Dexter and this man walked towards the hallway of Dion's room, and this man told Dexter, "I think something's wrong with Dion."
That's when I ran upstairs and told everybody else.
By the time Dexter comes back downstairs, this man is gone. He had left the residence.
Do you know his nickname? Or street name? Real name? I don't even know his first name.
At this point in the investigation, I have a dead body, I don't have a murder weapon, I have a 911 call, and I have 2 potential witnesses. I have no idea who committed this crime. I noticed a security camera in the hallway mounted to the ceiling, pointed to the front door, and then another camera on the 3rd floor.
We know we're going to get absolute facts from that if the image is captured. And we were able to reach out to the landlord of the building and get access to that video.
Dion was managing the property for me. I tell the detective from Baltimore City, say, hey, y'all can have the cameras. I'll give you all the cameras, give you every code you need, whatever you need.
The landlord provided me the name and password of the security system, and we're able to review the video footage.
Yeah, I'm with him now. Okay, it's W0RD.
I'm in.
Okay, thank you. We're in. Started at 7 p.m.
The first thing we want to do is corroborate the 911 caller as well as the witness statements. While watching the video, I see that Dexter is in the hallway, and I see an individual that he lets in the front door. A man enters wearing a gray t-shirt.
Dexter lets in the man dressed in a gray t-shirt that he went to the door for.
This individual then walks with Dexter towards the victim's room.
Dexter then leaves this person he's let in, and he goes up to the 3rd floor.
While Dexter's upstairs, the individual in the gray shirt appears to enter the victim's room.
Dexter's on the 3rd floor, which is where his mom, Paulette Richardson, is. There's a camera on that floor as well, in the hallway.
Switch to the upstairs camera.
We see Dexter go up to his mother, and they have a brief conversation, but it's exciting.
He told his mother what had happened. Paulette then went around to other rooms trying to notify the other residents.
Although there's no audio on the video, you could tell by the body language that something desperate has happened. It was tragic to them. You could tell they were affected by it. It was very helpful for us to corroborate their statements.
That matches with what he told us. Okay, switch back downstairs. Investigators rewind to around 7:30 p.m., the time when Dexter lets the unknown man into the apartment building. Can you punch it on him?
He's wearing a great short-sleeved T-shirt. It's got an emblem on the front of it. He's wearing jeans and some white sneakers with black shoelaces. And his demeanor is unusual. It's like he's going a little bit above and beyond to try and act like nothing has happened. By him trying not to be suspicious makes him look suspicious.
The video footage wasn't clear. It was dark.
We see the man walk off a camera toward Dion's apartment. He's off camera for a brief period of time.
Moments later, a second individual walks in.
He's going to Dion's room as well.
Both then leave the residence. We need to know who these two individuals are.
Anytime we locate video, we rewind back to see the victim earlier in the day. There may have been some things that took place that could help us to understand a motive or show a suspect casing the area, maybe doing their own reconnaissance of the victim before they decide to act. If they're on that video, then we have to eliminate them from being a suspect and just see what their absolute role is.
Detectives rewind the video to 8 a.m.
As we're watching the video from earlier in the day, you can see Dion. He comes walking out of his apartment. It looks like he's carrying some items like he's moving something from inside his residence out into the hallway.
What's going on?
And he also has a big, hefty trash bag that's full. He places that into the hallway, and then he kind of heads back toward the apartment.
Okay, I'm gonna call the landlord, see if he knows.
There was a lady that passed away on the second floor, and Dion liked the unit. It was bigger. So he decided he wanted to move upstairs, so that was the plan for the day.
Dion was going through the natural progression of working and seeing the benefits of, being employed and having the responsibilities of having your own place. He was so proud of himself. Like, he was finally on his own and had his own space.
Okay, thank you. It was a planned move. Hit play.
I observed Dexter in the hallway. This is approximately 10 a.m. in the morning.
It looks like he's helping Dion moving items from inside his apartment out into the hallway. You can see him then go to the front door, and he's interacting with somebody at the front door.
Who's that there? Punching?
But it looks like it's a man in dark clothing with some shorts on.
Okay, just keep the plan.
You don't see any kind of arguments. There's nothing that's taken place that would draw our attention to a potential motive or a suspect. It just looks like they're all helping Dion move out.
Detectives review the rest of the footage to see who else interacts with Dion that day.
Dion is with a man. He's dressed in like a white tank top and dark colored pants with some white tennis shoes with black laces. They're moving items out of the apartment into the hallway.
This video footage was grainy. It was very difficult to identify facial features, so you really need to pay attention to the way people are acting, to their body language.
This is somebody that Dion knows and he's comfortable with, but we're not certain what that gentleman's role is. We don't know really who he is yet, if he lives there, if he's just somebody that came over to help. And then things changed.
At 10:48 a.m., the man in the white tank top starts acting strangely.
We're watching through it more. We see this same gentleman that was helping Dion move things out into the hallway. Now his demeanor has changed. He's like pacing back and forth. He's walking toward the door and looking out the window and just kind of like something's bothering him. He's got this bag strapped to his back, and you could tell there's some agitation in his body language.
What's going on with him?
He still has this black bag around his arm.
Okay, just keep it plain.
You can see he unzips the bag.
What's he holding?
That's a shotgun.
He's carrying a shotgun, what looks like a pistol grip shotgun with a shorter barrel, and he's standing in the hallway. It's not normal to be carrying a shotgun out in the open. In fact, it's illegal to do that. So immediately this guy becomes a person of interest to us.
One of the residents walk in, and he actually tries to hide the shotgun behind his leg as they pass and keep walking by. The residents are coming and going out of the front door and just walk past him. I found it odd that They're in their own home, and they're passing this individual, and they're not making any contact with him.
At 11:30 a.m., Dion moves his belongings upstairs before he leaves the building via its back door.
Later in the day, about 5:56, the video shows this gentleman with the white tank top again. He's wearing a hat now. He's looking out the window. It's like he's waiting for someone.
The man walks towards Dion's apartment at 6:02 p.m. Dion returns to the house 5 minutes later.
We see Dion at 6:07 p.m.
Minutes later, we see the individual in the white tank top running out of Dion's room, down the hallway.
He cautiously opens the front door, looks out before actually walking outside.
Punch it in.
We're looking at it, we're zooming in on it, we're blowing it up.
It's the gun.
He has a pistol grip shotgun in his hand, and he's stuffing it down his pants. That's absolutely a shotgun, no question.
I know at this point that Dion was just murdered. This individual has to be identified, and quickly. Now that I have this suspect captured on video, the next step is to identify the individuals that are in the hallway with him that can possibly identify him. While reviewing the footage of the residents in the hallway and seeing as they pass this individual with a white tank top and not pay any attention to him, one person stands out. He passes him and actually does a double take. Looks at him, walks by, looks back again, and then continues on.
Who's that?
He looks familiar to me.
Go back to the footage from the morning. That's the same person.
This is one of the individuals that was helping Dion move his items out of his room in the morning. I asked myself, why is this man doing a double take? Does he know him, or does he know something's about to happen?
We need to locate and interview him and figure out what his role is.
While investigators track down the witness in the surveillance footage, members of the local community gather to pay tribute to Dion.
It was a visual. Like, in the immediate vicinity of where he was actually murdered, they drew "Rest in peace, Dion A."
I think everyone who loses a young person, in particular, to violence unexpectedly, we have to do something, because murder and violence in Baltimore is just so normalized. You have to do something to show, you know, the gravity of the loss. And the loss of a young person is such a huge loss. Their dreams are cut in half. I think people should be remembered, you know, how you last saw them and the truest version of themselves. And again, for me and Dion, it's that big old smile.
And when bad things happen to good people, a lot of people don't say anything, but yeah, the city did. They went above and beyond for Dion.
Once we have our suspect in mind, we now go back to the scene and we talk to the witnesses again.
Good day, sir. Can I ask you a couple questions about Dion Smith?
In talking with the residents, I discovered that Dion was the building maintenance man, as well as volunteer for the Kids Zone at the Drug Rehabilitation Center. Everyone I spoke to spoke very highly of Dion. He was very friendly, very charismatic, liked everybody and helped everybody.
Do you recognize any of these people?
The individual in the black shirt who was helping Dion move was his cousin. He was identified as Little Zamani. While finding out more about Dion and his past, it was discovered that the building that he lived in was owned by his family. And his cousin also stayed in the building.
Me, Dion, and Louis Imani are related. Well, actually cousins. My uncle bought the house in 1983. When he passed away in 2009, the house went into disarray. In 2016, we fixed it up. And I had asked Dion to manage the property for me. And you stay here for free. That might have made Little Imani feel a certain type of way because I had put Dion in a position of more responsibility.
We talked to neighbors to see if there's any kind of activity that may have led up to the crime occurring, a motive, if you will.
Hello. Has there been any trouble in the building lately?
One of the witnesses provided information, said they heard the cousin and Dion arguing about who was in charge of the building. Now we need to find out, is this the motive of why Dion was killed?
Hey, did you ever find Imani?
So I go to look for Imani to be questioned, and Imani can't be found. The family doesn't know where he is, his friends doesn't know where he is, he's not answering his phone. Imani has disappeared. Now I have to think to myself, why is Imani missing? Is it because he set up the murder of Dion? Or is it because he's scared and doesn't want to cooperate with the police? Because in Baltimore, snitches get stitches. It's important to get Imani into the office and interview him because he was in the hallway with the suspect. He is missing for 3 days, and I need to speak to him. I need to find out if he's involved in this or if he's a witness.
Right now, Louis Imani is gone in the wind. We have no idea where he's at. He's just missing. Until something motivates Little Imani to come back around, he ain't coming back around. If he's still around and come back around, you don't know if somebody there or if they not there, you know? That's how Baltimore is.
We have a unit inside a homicide called Homicide Operations, and they went searching for him. So they located Imani and brought him in for us to talk to him.
Little Imani tells detectives that he had a good relationship with Dion.
Just want to ask you a couple quick questions and we'll get you out of there, right?
No problem.
Okay. I'm going to show you a quick video.
Okay.
Any idea who that is?
While being interviewed, Imani advised that he recognized the suspect, but he didn't know the suspect's real name. He was ruled out as being an accomplice and is no longer involved in this investigation. It was great to have Imani come in, but it didn't solve this case. We needed more information.
We're really against the clock. Once the bad guy commits a crime like a homicide, they know that the police are now doing everything in their power to find out who this is.
In certain cases where you have video footage and you have a suspect captured on that footage and there's no one to identify that individual, we reach out into the public.
Hey, can you put out an appeal for information for me?
We have a unit in the police department known as our Public Information Office. And what we do is we create a segment of video that best shows the suspect. We put that out to that unit, who then contacts all of our media outlets, Facebook, Instagram, all of those things, to see if anybody can identify who this is.
Let's watch those CCTV cameras for now while we wait.
I went back to the morning, the day that Dion was murdered, and I reviewed more footage.
Play from where the residents walked past the guy with the gun.
There's another individual that walks past the suspect and glances back at him. Now I want to know who this person is, and can they identify the suspect?
I'll ask the residents if anybody recognizes this guy.
Okay.
The man that passed as the suspect is identified as Willie. We find out through residents that he also lives in the building.
At the same time, detectives compile a list of suspects following their appeal for information.
Hello?
Tips started coming in right away.
Can you spell it? Okay, great. Thanks.
When searching these names, we found that some of the names had criminal records with their photographs attached to the record.
Willie comes to the station to review a photo lineup of these potential suspects.
Another detective who's not involved in the investigation comes in and shows the witness this photographed array.
Greetings and salutations, my good man. How you doing, sir? All is well, all is well.
The way a photographic array works is that you take 6 photographs, one being who you believe to be the suspect, and then 5 other photographs of people that are similar looking. And you present them to the witness, and you let them look at them one at a time.
Do you look at one again? Yeah, can I think it was this one, I think. That one. That one. That one. Which one? This one? I don't know his name. Okay.
Willie positively identifies number 5 out of the 6 photographs. Willie is confident that this is the individual that was in the hallway. He tells us that he knows the person only by face and has seen him hanging out in the area but doesn't know his name. Number 5 is Terrell Gibson. Now we do a background investigation on Terrell Gibson.
He had a history of selling drugs. He also had possession of a deadly weapon.
Hello. Yeah, what can you tell me about Terrell Gibson?
Our investigation determined that Terrell had recently been released from prison and he needed a place to stay.
Okay, great. Okay.
He knew Dion, and he asked Dion if he could stay at his place. Dion, being the person he is, allowed Terrell to stay in his room.
If Dion had to share a sofa with Terrell, he would. You know, if he had to sleep on the floor and give Terrell the only pillow, like that's the person that Dion is. And Dion barely had enough for himself, but still, you know, allowed himself to help.
Dion helped him because he knew him. They grew up together. I guess Dion was sympathetic to the situation. I think Dion wanted to have somebody that kind of went through the same things he went through come out like how he came out. But I don't think Terrell had the type of support system that Dion had. And Dion wanted to support Terrell to see if it would help him become a better person.
Investigators scour the CCTV footage for clues to unlock Terrell's motive for killing Dion.
I spend hours reviewing this footage, going through every second, every minute. I identify an individual in the hallway, and this individual walks up to Dion's shoeboxes. There's several shoeboxes in the hallway. And this individual picks out one shoebox from this whole pile, walks away back to Dion's room.
Rob, come have a look at this.
About 10 minutes later, he comes back and places the shoebox on top of the rest of the shoeboxes that were in the hallway. Goes to the front door, and he opens the door and looks outside as if looking for someone. And then he comes back to the shoebox and puts it back in the exact order that he found it.
What's he doing?
It looks suspicious because at that time, I'm wondering what's in that shoebox, why is he hiding it, and why does he return it to the same exact spot when no one's around?
I think I seen him later in the day. Can you fast forward?
Yep.
The same individual that took the shoebox from Dion is now talking to Terrell in the hallway. The conversation is normal at first, but then it becomes more animated, and it's obvious these two are arguing. My first thoughts are, well, he stole something out of that shoebox, something valuable. It could be money or drugs. Is this possibly a motive?
We know Terrell had a pretty extensive history of drug dealing.
Is he hiding drugs there?
That may have been the cause of it, that, because the unknown man removed the shoebox from the hallway, that maybe that had something to do with the murder. While we're reviewing the footage, we're looking literally at every aspect. The behaviors of the way people are acting, the way they walk.
Go to the man in gray who Dexter lets in.
What we start to realize is that the gentleman in the gray t-shirt is the same shape and build as the gentleman in the tank top.
Punch in there.
He has these very distinct tennis shoes on. He's wearing Air Jordans, and they're white in color with black laces, and they have kind of an interesting shape on the heel of the shoe.
Go to Terrell earlier.
All the other features match. The height, the weight, the way he walks, the way he kind of wears his pants, kind of pulled down. The gentleman with the gray t-shirt is the person with the white tank top on.
Terrell Gibson had changed his clothes after the murder, but he still had the same walk, the same look, the same distinct features, and he was still wearing the same jeans and same tennis shoes.
You're right.
Terrell Gibson came back to the house, I believe, to clean up any evidence that he left and to distance himself from being there when the murder was committed. At that point, I eliminated everybody else for being a suspect. Terrell was the one responsible for the murder of Dion. We got an arrest warrant for Terrell Gibson, but we didn't know where he was because he was on the run at that time. We need to locate him.
We know we're running against the clock. How do we know the suspect isn't going to come back and try to take out witnesses now or commit other crimes?
We now had an arrest warrant for Terrell Gibson, but we didn't know where he was.
We have a division called WATF, Warrant Apprehension Task Force. They have a squad of detectives. That's their entire mission, is to go and find this person. They go to known locations first, and they kind of work their way out from there. They go to relatives' houses. They do it through electronic surveillance. They'll contact people that are known to the suspect.
On the morning of July 6, 2017, the Warrant Apprehension Task Force found Terrell Gibson at his mother's house. They knocked on the door. They were actually let in by Terrell's mother. They then searched the house. He was hiding in the basement. They arrested him and brought him to the homicide office to be interrogated.
You were brought down here Dion got killed? Right. You were brought down here in reference to that, and just some things I want to talk to you about. All right, about that whole incident. You don't want to talk? I don't want to talk because if I don't got my lawyer present, I totally understand. I get it. I ain't trying to solve incriminating myself.
It's always disappointing when they don't want to talk to us. You know, it's, I think just from a human standpoint, I mean, to take another human life, there's nothing worse than that. It's almost like we're due an explanation.
If they don't want to speak to me, it doesn't bother me at all. I already have everything I need.
If anything, it makes them look more guilty.
After Terrell was arrested, we went back to his mother's house to conduct a search and seizure warrant to try to locate any evidence in reference to his case. We did not locate a gun, clothing, or any other evidence that could be helpful. Not having the murder weapon is actually common in most murders. The video footage in this case is really all the evidence we need. Seeing him run to that house and shoving that shotgun down the front of his pants, that's the evidence we need to convict Terrell Gibson.
Terrell Gibson is charged with the murder of Dion Smith. His trial begins on September 25th, 2018.
Terrell Gibson showed no remorse throughout the entire trial.
He didn't want to explain anything to us. He didn't want to tell us why it happened.
The jury found Terrell Gibson guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison.
Nobody else seen in the CCTV footage from the apartment is charged with any wrongdoing.
It was a good feeling to get him off the street. Think about what he did. It's a heinous crime. He took a shotgun to somebody that he knew, a close friend of his, and killed him, senselessly killed him. And not just shot him, but shot him right in the head with a shotgun. I mean, that's violent. It's as violent as you could be. It's very close, it's very personal. Baltimore City is just a little bit safer because he's no longer there.
The state's attorney definitely relied on this video footage to seal a conviction.
Had we not found video in this case, this would have been a difficult case to solve. It was really an incredible piece of evidence.
Terrell's trial fails to establish a motive for Dion's murder. Dion's family are left to speculate why Terrell killed his friend.
What I think happened, my theory is, Dion, when he went to go moving the stuff from his first floor unit to the second floor unit, he found something that wasn't supposed to be there. I think Dion stashed it. I honestly think Dion was holding it in the other room. And Terrell's at the apartment, like, well, they there looking. They can't find it. It must have been important enough for him to murder somebody over, because that's what he did. He killed my cousin behind whatever he couldn't find. Dion wasn't trying to deal with that type of lifestyle. He wasn't trying to be around that. You might have did something negative in your past, but that don't mean that you're going to keep doing negative stuff in your future. And Dion didn't want nobody to look at him like that. So he had friends that dealt with that, but he was nowhere near a part of any of that type of stuff. Hopefully one day he'll tell us, because that's the only thing that could put me at ease about anything. We just would like to know what happened.
That monster gave no thought to the loss that Dion's children will forever experience.
I probably never will find anybody.
The dark soil of the Ohio River Valley does not decay its secrets. It petrifies them, waiting for the generational clock to run down to absolute zero. For nearly 4 decades, the dense, humid woods bordering the industrial outskirts of Steubenville held a static frequency, a silent, vibrating terror that sat beneath the damp topsoil, beneath the root structures of the ancient sycamores, entirely undetected by the changing world above. It was the winter of 1988, a year defined by structural economic collapse, frozen steel mills, and a heavy, ash-gray fog that never seemed to lift from the river basin. A 19-year-old college student vanished on a freezing December night, leaving behind an empty car with its driver's side door flung wide open, a single leather shoe lying in the slush, and a lifetime of unanswered agonizing questions. They called it a vanished anomaly, a baseline failure of local law enforcement, and eventually, the sterile cabinets of the county archives swallowed the case file under the label of an permanent cold case. But a crime of this magnitude does not dissipate. It merely waits for the forensic ice to break, and when it did, the structural integrity of a prominent local family disintegrated within 48 hours. Picture the architecture of a small-town cover-up, a well-respected figure in the community, a family business that anchored the local economy, and a microscopic fragment of physical evidence buried so deep in a private salvage yard that 2 generations grew up playing hide-and-seek over the very machine that contained the final, mechanical trace of a murder. There were no emergency sirens on that freezing night in 1988. The atmospheric pressure over Jefferson County had dropped to a critical low, bringing with it a blinding, wet snowfall that choked the visibility on Route 7 down to less than 10 feet. When the patrol car discovered the abandoned sedan on the shoulder of the highway, the engine was still warm, the radio humming with low-frequency static, and a half-burnt cigarette resting in the plastic ashtray, its blue smoke curling inside the cabin like a tiny, captured phantom. There were no immediate signs of a violent struggle, no shattered safety glass, no pools of crimson spreading across the vinyl upholstery. It was a subtraction so violent and clean it left the investigators completely paralyzed. The girl had simply dropped out of existence between her shift at the local pharmacy and the 5-mile drive to her family's farmhouse. The initial investigation was an exercise in systematic incompetence, a series of missteps, contaminated tire tracks, and lost witness statements that allowed the primary scent to grow cold before the snow had even stopped falling. By the 6th month, the files were stagnant, the public focus drifted back to the shuttering of the factories, and the family was left marooned in a quiet, permanent state of grief that slowly ossified into an unbreakable silence. The town itself became an accessory to the vacuum. The old river culture of Steubenville, hardened by decades of economic depression and institutional distrust, learned to treat the 1988 disappearance as a forbidden folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to young girls walking home from the bus stop after dark. The neighborhood protected its survival by pretending the predator was a drifter, a phantom truck driver who had paused on the interstate for a brief, opportunistic hunting session before dissolving back into the interstate system. This collective delusion allowed the local elite to maintain their positions, to shake hands at church services, and to build residential developments over the very fields where the search parties had once hacked through the frozen briars. But the land holds the memory of the wait. Beneath the surface of an old automotive scrap yard 3 miles from the highway, tucked inside the rusting shell of an industrial car crusher that had been decommissioned weeks after the disappearance, a single, microscopic signature of blood had bonded with the hydraulic fluid, forming a chemical compound that resisted decades of rain, rust, and seasonal freezing. The transition into the modern era did nothing to diminish the localized trauma. It merely covered it with a layer of digital noise. The children of the community grew up under a heightened, almost animalistic state of suspicion, watching their parents double-lock the doors every time the river fog rolled over the blacktop. The missing girl's mother died in 2005, her bedroom kept in the exact condition it had been on that December afternoon, the clock on the nightstand unplugged at 9:14, the estimated minute the sedan's engine died on the shoulder of Route 7. The original detectives moved into retirement homes or graves, their handwritten field notes ending up in cardboard boxes stacked in damp police basements, their pages growing yellow and brittle, holding names that no one in the precinct could pronounce anymore. The case had become an administrative relic, a line of data in a federal database that was routinely skipped over during the weekly updates, a ghost story that had lost its teeth, but retained its capacity to chill the air whenever a rookie deputy pulled the old box out of the dark. The structural collapse of the mystery didn't begin with a brilliant investigative insight. It began with a routine environmental inspection. In the spring of 2026, the State Environmental Protection Agency ordered a comprehensive core drilling operation at the long-abandoned industrial scrapyard, testing the water table for heavy metal contamination before a commercial warehouse could be constructed on the site. When the pneumatic drills bit into the compacted earth beneath the heavy iron base of the old 1980s car crusher, they didn't bring up soil or oil sludge. They brought up a deep, dark layer of old clay that carried a highly irregular, organic odor. The technician on site, a veteran of toxic cleanups, recognized the scent instantly. It was the unmistakable smell of deep subterranean decomposition, a pocket of biological matter that had been hermetically sealed away from the oxygen for 38 years under 10 tons of scrap metal and reinforced concrete. The emergency call to the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation bypassed the local precinct entirely, bringing a team of forensic anthropologists and cold case specialists to the scrap yard under the cover of a torrential spring rainstorm. They didn't use heavy machinery. They used small, manual tools, their headlamps cutting through the thick, gray mist that rose from the excavated pit. The work was slow, agonizing, and conducted in absolute, professional silence. As they cleared away the rusted iron plates of the machine's undercarriage, they exposed a hidden, unrecorded structural vault, a secondary containment space that had been crudely welded shut using an industrial torch from the late 80s. Inside that iron tomb, preserved by the lack of air and the toxic mix of ancient lubricants, lay the physical truth of December 1988, a skull, a sequence of fractured ribs showing the clear, violent marks of a heavy, blunt instrument, and a single silver ring still gripping the bone of the left hand, its engraving of initials still legible under the white glare of the forensic flashlights. The identification hit the community with the force of an industrial explosion. The headlines were dawned up, hitting the regional news cycle like a sequence of physical blows. Forgotten 1988 cold case solved. Chilling evidence leads to arrest. The shock wasn't just in the recovery of the remains, it was in the geographical location of the tomb. The scrap yard had belonged to the family of the town's former councilman, a man who had sat on the committee that oversaw the initial budget for the missing person search in 1989. The monster hadn't been a drifter. He hadn't been a phantom on the interstate. He was the man who had signed the checks for the posters, the man who had stood on the steps of the courthouse promising justice to the weeping parents, while the entire time, his own industrial machinery was holding the bones of the victim 3 feet beneath his office floorboards. The arrest of the now 74-year-old patriarch was a surreal, cinematic spectacle that played out in the driveway of his historic brick mansion overlooking the Ohio River. There were no sirens, no dramatic foot chases, just 3 unmarked black SUVs blocking the exit, and a pair of young detectives in heavy trench coats walking up the stone steps with a warrant that had been signed 38 years too late. The old man met them at the door, his frame hunched over a silver walker, his eyes glassy and blank under his white eyebrows. He didn't ask what they wanted. He didn't call his attorney. He simply looked past them at the dark water of the river and muttered a single, chilling phrase that was captured by the body-worn camera of the lead officer. The ground finally got tired of holding her. It wasn't an act of remorse. It was the clinical acknowledgement of a mechanical failure, the realization that his architecture of concealment had simply reached its expiration date. As the old man was loaded into the back of the cruiser, his family stood on the lawn in a state of absolute, paralyzed devastation. His son, who had taken over the legitimate manufacturing branches of the family business, looked at his father not with grief, but with a terrifying, hollow realization. Every asset they owned, every college tuition that had been paid, every country club membership that had secured their social status for 4 decades, had been funded by the economic stability of a life built on top of a grave. They were the children of a monster, their inheritance stained by the physical reality of the 1988 ambush. The community that had praised their philanthropy for 30 years turned on them within an hour, their names dragged through the mud of internet forums, their storefronts targeted by silent, staring crowds of locals who stood on the sidewalks in the rain, watching the family home as if it were a monument to a multi-decade slaughter. The forensic laboratory in Columbus became the final arena for the verification of the horror. The pathologists worked under high-intensity lights, examining the iron vaults and the hydraulic fluid samples for the microscopic evidence that would connect the old man's hands to the execution. They discovered that the blood found inside the crusher's piston housing matched the victim's DNA profile with a probability statistic that defied any legal defense, a 1 in a billion certainty written in the language of calcium and old protein. The defense attorneys tried to argue chain of custody failures, to point to the degradation of the files, but the science was absolute. The cold case was solved, the body was recovered, and the killer was behind bars, but the resolution offered no closure to the valley. The truth had arrived not as a healing agent, but as a destructive force, tearing down the illusions of small-town safety and leaving behind a raw, bleeding vacancy that would continue to haunt the lineage of everyone who had ever called that river basin home. The cold case files were officially moved from the active drawers to the historical archives of the state police, their tabs marked with a black ink stamp, resolved by forensic identification. The administrative machinery had completed its function, checking off the boxes, updating the federal mainframes, and closing out a 19-year-old girl's timeline with a clinical period. But for the survivors who lived along Route 7, the story has no ending. They live with the permanent awareness of the fault line beneath their feet, the knowledge that the most terrifying predators don't live in the distant woods or the dark alleys of foreign cities. They sit in the front rows of your city councils, fund your parks, shake your hands at the supermarket, and watch you grow up through eyes that have already calculated the exact amount of ready-mix concrete required to silence the truth forever. The atmospheric density of Steubenville in the winter of 1988 was dictated by the dying breath of the open hearth furnaces. When the patrol car first pulled behind the abandoned sedan on Route 7, the air was a thick, yellow soup of sulfur and flash-frozen sleet that coated the police spotlights in a greasy, opaque film. The vehicle, a common domestic four-door, was positioned at a slight, unnatural angle against the guardrail, its front wheels turned sharply toward the frozen river basin below. To the first responding deputy, the scene carried the hallmarks of a routine mechanical failure, a slipped transmission or a frozen fuel line that had forced a young driver to seek shelter in a passing commercial truck. But when his flashlight beam crossed the interior threshold, the mundane reality vanished, leaving behind a cold, structural void. The driver's side door was not merely unlatched. It had been forced back against its hinges until the metal groaned, a violent, physical overextension that left a deep crease in the front fender panel. On the slush-covered asphalt directly beneath the sill lay a single, low-heeled leather shoe, its buckle torn away from the strap by a sudden, horizontal force that had dragged the occupant out of the cabin before she could engage the emergency brake. Inside the vehicle, the keys were still turning slowly in the ignition, the small plastic keychain clicking against the steering column like a mechanical pulse counting down the seconds of a life interrupted mid-sentence. On the passenger seat sat a stack of pharmacology textbooks, their pages crisp and dry, containing handwritten lecture notes from that morning's classes at the community college. The initial response by the county sheriff's department was defined by a specific, regional complacency. In a river town where the sudden disappearance of a worker usually meant a long-haul flight to a shipyard in Mississippi or a voluntary relocation to the auto plants of Detroit, the concept of a predatory abduction inside the city limits was an ideological impossibility. The deputies walked the shoulder of the highway with handheld lanterns, their boots sinking 4 inches into the gray slush, searching the immediate tree line for footprints or a discarded purse. They found nothing but the empty beer cans and shredded semi-truck tires that littered the borders of Route 7. There was no blood on the upholstery, no signs of ballistic impact on the glass, no structural damage to the cabin that would suggest a struggle of lethal proportions. By noon the following day, the disappearance had begun to curdle into a localized scandal. The victim's family, owners of a small dairy farm 5 miles outside the industrial perimeter, had gathered in the lobby of the precinct, their faces lined with a specific, silent terror of people who knew the land too well to believe in a voluntary flight. They sat on the wooden benches, their hands raw from the winter milking shifts, listening to the clatter of the manual typewriters and the low, indifferent murmurs of the dispatchers. The lead investigator, a man whose professional horizon was limited to the processing of tavern brawls and equipment thefts from the mills, treated the family's panic with a clinical, administrative detachment. He assured them that girls of 19 often found the routine of the farm oppressive, that she would likely call from a motel in Pittsburgh before the weekend was over. This institutional indifference allowed the primary physical signature of the crime to be erased within 48 hours. The vehicle was towed to a commercial storage yard without its tires being cast, without its interior panels being checked for latent hair or fiber transfers, and without a comprehensive analysis of the mud packed into the wheel wells. The weather, too, was an accessory to the concealment. A secondary blizzard descended on the valley on Thursday night, dumping 8 inches of heavy, wet snow over Route 7, packing the ditches with ice, and smoothing out the shoulder until every trace of the assailant's vehicle was compressed into a uniform, white sheet of concrete. The timeline had been sanitized by the climate, the facts buried beneath the seasonal freeze before the first formal witness interview was ever recorded in the master ledger. The husband of the victim's older sister, an apprentice machinist named Thomas Logan, was the only family member who refused to leave the precinct lobby. He was a quiet man, his fingers stained with the black grease of the lathe shops, his eyes small, dark, and set deep beneath an unyielding brow. He spent his hours building an independent chronology of that Tuesday afternoon, tracking the 5-mile route from the pharmacy where the girl worked to the spot where her car had been abandoned. He noted the placement of every gravel pit, every independent truck stop, and every industrial scrapyard that sat along the river corridor. He knew that the river road wasn't just a transport artery, it was an industrial hunting ground, a place where a vehicle could be stopped without drawing the attention of the few houses that stood behind the sycamore trees. Logan's notes, written in a grease-stained surveyor's book, focused heavily on the movements of the commercial vehicles that serviced the local salvage operations. In 1988, the scrap yards along the Ohio River were operating at maximum capacity, processing the structural steel of the shuttered mills into raw material for the foundries of Pittsburgh and Youngstown. The traffic was a chaotic, unregulated stream of flatbeds, dump trucks, and mobile cranes that moved through the valley without logbooks or manifest checks. A car could be intercepted on the shoulder, loaded into the back of a commercial hauler, and moved inside a secure industrial perimeter within 15 minutes, completely invisible to the occasional patrol car that cruised the blacktop. The sheriff's office, under mounting pressure from the local newspaper and the political committee of the city council, finally launched a coordinated search of the valley in the 3rd week of January. They brought in a volunteer fire department dive team to cut through the ice of the Ohio River near the lock system, dropping iron hooks into the black, sluggish current to search for a body or a discarded piece of clothing. They spent 4 days dragging the riverbed, their cables coming up caked with industrial slag, old river silt, and the heavy timber of sunken barges, but there was no sign of the 19-year-old student. The river was as blind and uncooperative as the land, its current holding its secrets beneath a 6-inch cap of gray ice that groaned under the weight of the winter tugboats. The investigation then shifted to the standard canvassing of the regional rooming houses and interstate diners. The detectives interviewed the long-haul drivers who frequented the diesel stops on Route 7, showing them the black and white high school portrait of the missing girl. The drivers looked at the picture with the flat, incurious eyes of men who saw 1,000 faces a week between Chicago and Baltimore, shaking their heads before returning to their coffee and their logbooks. The consensus among the investigators began to harden into a comfortable theory. She had been picked up by a non-local driver, a long-distance predator who had crossed the state line before the car door had even settled back on its latches. This narrative was highly convenient for the local authorities. It removed the stain of the violence from the county, transforming a potential murder into a federal anomaly that belonged to the interstate highway system. But inside the scrap yard of the former councilman, located just 3 miles from the highway marker, the mechanical reality of October 1988 was being systematically compressed. The facility was a sprawling, 5-acre labyrinth of rusted iron, discarded boiler tubes, and mountain-high piles of sheet metal that had been stripped from the interior of the local rolling mills. At the center of this industrial wasteland stood a massive, custom-built hydraulic car crusher, a machine from the late 1970s that exerted 400 tons of linear pressure, capable of reducing a standard domestic sedan into a solid, 2-foot block of dense iron within 90 seconds. The operator of the machine was the councilman's eldest son, a 26-year-old named Raymond Vance, whose reputation in the valley was defined by his quiet, territorial efficiency and his absolute devotion to his father's business. Raymond Vance was a man who moved through the town with the confidence of someone whose name was written into the property deeds of the county. He lived in a modern brick ranch house built on a bluff overlooking the yard, his windows offering a panoramic view of the cranes and the processing pits below. He spent his evenings in his workshop, his hands busy with the restoration of classic muscle cars, using the facility's industrial torches and welding rigs to rebuild the frames of old Chevrolets and Fords. To the neighbors, he was the logical successor to the family lineage, a hard-working son who had chosen the dirt of the yard over the corporate offices of Columbus. They never noticed that in the days following the December disappearance, Raymond had ordered 3 truckloads of ready-mix concrete to be delivered to the yard after 5 o'clock in the evening, explaining to the drivers that he was reinforcing the stabilizing pad beneath the heavy car crusher to prevent the machine from tipping during the winter freezes. The concrete pour was completed under the cover of the heavy river fog that rolled over the basin on the night of December 14th. Raymond operated the mixer himself, his long-handled trowel smoothing out a 6-inch layer of wet cement directly over the secondary inspection vault, a subterranean service pit located under the machine's main hydraulic pistons. The pit was designed to collect the waste fluids of the crushed vehicles, the motor oil, the transmission fluid, and the antifreeze that would drain out during the compression process. By sealing this vault with reinforced concrete, Raymond wasn't just repairing the pad. He was creating a permanent, subterranean containment vault, a structural tomb that would isolate whatever lay inside from the oxygen, the moisture, and the eyes of any future inspector. The family of the missing girl, meanwhile, was experiencing a slow, agonizing disintegration. The father stopped working the dairy farm, spending his days sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, his eyes fixed on the gravel road that led to the highway, waiting for a vehicle that never turned into the drive. The mother retreated into a silent, religious ritualism, keeping a single candle burning in the window of her daughter's bedroom until the tallow melted into the wood of the sill. They were living in a permanent state of suspended animation, their lives defined entirely by a negative space, their home transformed into a monument to a question that the state had decided was no longer worth answering. The social fabric of Steubenville was being quietly rewoven around the vacuum. The local merchants stopped mentioning the name of the missing girl during their weekly Chamber of Commerce meetings. They didn't want the reputation of the town to be associated with an unsolved mystery at a time when they were trying to attract new chemical processing plants to the riverfront. The story became an old news clipping, a piece of yellowed history tucked into the back of the ledger books at the public library. Its presence only felt during the long, gray months of winter when the fog would roll off the water and fill the streets with the scent of wet coal dust and old iron. The community had accepted the lie because the lie allowed them to keep their shops open, to maintain their clubs, and to pretend that their children were safe behind the vinyl siding of their suburban developments. Thomas Logan was the only one who kept the memory alive. Every April, when the river ice broke and the mud in the ditches turned to a soft, brown clay, he would walk the perimeter of the scrap yards along Route 7, his notebook in his pocket, his eyes scanning the equipment lines for any sign of structural alteration. He noticed the new concrete pad beneath the councilman's car crusher in the spring of 1990. He stood on the public right-of-way outside the chain-link fence, his binoculars focused on the clean, gray edge of the cement that protruded from beneath the rusted iron base of the machine. He noted the date of the modification in his book, matching it against the timeline of the initial search, but without a warrant, without probable cause, and without the support of a sheriff's department that was funded by the councilman's political action committee. The entry remained a useless deduction, a fragment of suspicion written in grease-stained ink that no one else would ever see. Logan died of lung cancer in 2012, his notebooks inherited by his daughter, Clara, who kept them in a cedar chest in her basement in Zanesville. She grew up knowing only the rumors of her aunt's disappearance, the story having become a family myth, a piece of genetic tragedy that manifested as a chronic, low-level anxiety that made her double-check the locks on her own doors every time her husband was late coming home from his shift at the manufacturing plant. The lineage had been altered by the cold case, its members carrying the weight of the missing woman in their bones, their bodies keeping score of a crime that the law had forgotten before they were even born. The mechanical car crusher on the riverfront operated continuously until 1998, its heavy steel jaws processing thousands of tons of Ohio vehicles, its hydraulic cylinders leaking thousands of gallons of black motor oil that soaked into the concrete pad, staining the surface into a uniform, greasy black that hid the edges of Raymond Vance's secret pour. When the facility was finally closed down following the bankruptcy of the councilman's estate, the gates were chained shut, the office windows smashed by local teenagers, and the weeds allowed to reclaim the spaces between the iron piles. The machine stood there in the center of the wasteland like a rusted monument to an industrial age that had passed, its pistons frozen in mid-stroke, its internal vaults holding the physical truth of December 1988 beneath a 3-inch cap of oil-soaked concrete and 10 tons of iron plating. The system had succeeded in its primary function. It had protected the architecture of the town from the disruptive energy of the truth. Raymond Vance grew old in his brick ranch house on the bluff, his status as a local businessman unblemished by the rumors that occasionally surfaced in the taverns near the river. He became a grandfather, his living room filled with photos of smiling children who went to university in Columbus, their lives clean, comfortable, and entirely insulated from the mud of the scrap yard below. He had engineered a perfect solution, using his knowledge of industrial materials and his family's political capital to build a wall of silence that had outlasted the investigators, the parents, and the very structure of the mills that had built the town. But the physical code of a crime scene cannot be deleted by a change in property values or the passage of 3 decades. Beneath the frozen iron plates of the car crusher, in the anaerobic dark of the inspection vault, the silver ring on the 19-year-old student's left hand was undergoing a slow, mineral transformation, its metal surface bonding with the calcium of the bone and the synthetic polymers of the hydraulic fluid. It was a chemical ledger that was keeping track of the debt, waiting for the moment when the modern state would bring its drilling rigs and its core samplers to the riverfront, forcing the earth to open its mouth and surrender the evidence that would drop the curtain on Raymond Vance's long, comfortable illusion of security. The stage was set for a geological extraction of a secret that had stayed cold for 38 years, but was about to break the surface with the violent, undeniable momentum of an industrial explosion. The drilling crew from the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency arrived at the abandoned Steubenville salvage yard on a damp morning in March 2026, their trucks splashing through yellow puddles of iron-tinted runoff that had collected in the tire ruts of the access road. They were not there to look for history. They were there to measure the ppm of trichloroethylene and polychlorinated biphenyls that had leaked into the river basin from 40 years of unregulated industrial processing. The site had sat under a chain-link padlock since the councilman's estate went through liquidation in the early 2000s, its mountain-high piles of sheet metal and rusted boiler tubes slowly sinking into the wild mustard and thistle that reclaimed the riverfront. It was a dead zone, an unmarketable expanse of industrial slag that the city wanted to sanitize and convert into an enterprise zone before the state funding for brownfield remediation expired. The lead technician, a man who had spent 20 years running core sampling rigs through the oil-soaked soils of the Rust Belt, set his truck stabilizers near the center of the concrete pad that supported the old 1980s car crusher. The machine itself was an ancient, black iron monolith, its heavy hydraulic pistons frozen in a state of mid-compression, its metal framework caked in a thick, waxy grease that had trapped decades of river dust and soot from the remaining steel foundries upriver. The technician adjusted the pneumatic pressure on his diamond-tipped core drill, a heavy, 4-inch cylinder designed to cut through reinforced industrial cement with the same indifferent efficiency that a saw cuts through pine. He engaged the clutch, and the high-pitched scream of the drill bit striking the concrete echoed across the empty basin, breaking a silence that had hung over the property since the gate was locked. The drill cut through the top 3 inches of oil-stained cement with relative ease, the cooling water running off the pad in a milky, white stream that smelled faintly of old lime and detergent. But as the bit sank deeper, into the secondary layer of concrete that Raymond Vance had poured on that December night in 1988. The machine began to labor, its engine pitch dropping into a low, metallic groan that indicated a sudden, unexpected change in the material's density. The technician increased the downward hydraulic force, his eyes fixed on the pressure gauge. The bit was striking something that didn't have the uniform consistency of standard commercial aggregate. It was a rough, hand-mixed matrix of river gravel and heavy slag that had been compressed with manual tools before the cement could set. With a sudden, wet pop, the drill broke through the bottom of the concrete pad, dropping 6 inches into an unrecorded subterranean void. The technician cut the power, the sudden silence of the yard feeling heavier than the noise had been. He cleared the slurry from the mouth of the borehole, hooked a long steel retrieval wire to the center of the core barrel, and hoisted the sample out of the ground. The cylinder of concrete that emerged was a physical timeline of the yard's history. The top 3 inches were a uniform, machine-poured gray from the late 70s. The bottom section was a jagged, dark mass of hand-mixed cement caked with a thick layer of a yellow, organic clay that did not belong to the surface geology of the riverfront. The odor hit the crew before the core sample had even been unhooked from the rig. It wasn't the chemical tang of diesel fuel or the rotten egg smell of sulfur from the old coke plants. It was a deep, sweet, and suffocating musk, the unmistakable signature of anaerobic biological decomposition that had been locked away from the atmosphere for decades inside a sealed containment cell. The technician, who had worked on municipal sewer replacements and old cemetery relocations, backed away from the rig, his face turning a pale, bloodless white under his hard hat. He didn't check the pH of the soil, nor did he log the core depth into his digital tablet. He reached into his truck, grabbed his radio, and placed a direct call to the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation in Columbus, bypassing the local county sheriff's office entirely. The BCI cold case unit arrived at 3 o'clock that afternoon, their unmarked black utility vans parking in a defensive perimeter around the old car crusher. The team was led by a forensic anthropologist whose entire professional life was spent interpreting the microfractures in old calcium and the chemical signatures left behind by human tissue in the mud. They brought with them portable light towers, heavy ventilation fans to clear the vapors from the borehole, and a series of high-resolution fiber-optic inspection cameras that could survive the toxic environment of an underground vault. They moved with a quiet, military precision that completely ignored the local precinct deputies who had gathered at the chain-link gate, their arms crossed, their faces tight with a sudden, localized panic. The anthropologist knelt beside the borehole, her headlamp cutting through the thick gray mist that rose from the opening as the cooling water evaporated on the frozen concrete. She lowered the inspection camera down the narrow shaft, her eyes fixed on the portable video monitor that sat on the hood of her van. The lens slid through the 4 inches of concrete, past the hand-mixed aggregate layer, and entered the darkness of the subterranean inspection pit. The screen flickered with static for a second before the autofocus locked onto the physical reality of December 1988, a small, rectangular vault lined with rotted timber boards, its floor covered in a thick layer of black hydraulic fluid that had preserved everything it touched like a pool of prehistoric tar. There, lying in the center of the iron basin directly beneath the main piston housing of the crusher, was a shape that did not belong to the history of automotive salvage. The camera tracked the line of a long, delicate bone, a human femur, its surface stained a deep, greasy brown by the old lubricants, but its structure completely intact. Further down the trench, emerging from the sludge like an artifact being recovered from a shipwreck, was the unmistakable, elegant curve of a human skull, its cranium resting against the iron framework of the machine's drain line, its jaw slightly offset as if it were still trying to speak across the 38-year void. The extraction process was an agonizing, manual labor that lasted through the night, the freezing rain from the river basin coating the Tyvek suits of the recovery team in a thin, glass-like shell of ice. They didn't use the jackhammers. They used air-powered chisels and manual sludges to widen the borehole, breaking away Raymond Vance's hand-mixed cement in small, 5-pound chunks that were bagged and numbered with the meticulous care of a museum excavation. The air inside the pit was a toxic soup of pulverized stone, old lime, and the high-density hydrocarbons of the hydraulic fluid, requiring the technicians to work in full-face respirators that clicked rhythmically in the dark like mechanical lungs. As the anthropologist cleared the dark clay from the skull's eye sockets with a small, soft-bristled brush, she noted a distinct physical signature on the left temple panel, a clean, semicircular indentation that had fractured the bone inward toward the brain cavity. It wasn't the result of a blunt force trauma from a random weapon like a pipe or a club. It was a mechanical imprint, its dimensions matching the exact diameter of the heavy iron stabilizer pins used to lock the car crusher's side gates into place during operation. The 19-year-old student hadn't been killed on the highway. She had been brought inside the perimeter of the yard while she was still breathing. Her life ended against the iron framework of the machine that was intended to be her tomb. Michael Logan, the nephew of the missing girl and the current keeper of his father's grease-stained surveyor's books, received the news in his kitchen in Zanesville while the morning news broadcast was still scrolling through the local weather alerts. The anchor's voice had a sudden, dramatic urgency that made him drop his coffee cup, the dark liquid spreading across the linoleum like a stain. The screen showed a live aerial view of the Steubenville scrap yard, the yellow BCI tents glowing like lanterns under the gray sky, the heavy iron frame of the car crusher surrounded by state police cruisers. The headline on the ticker was Don Dapp, hitting his eyes with a physical weight. Forgotten 1988 cold case solved. Chilling evidence leads to arrest. Michael didn't call his sister, nor did he contact the local police. He went down into his own cellar, opened the old cedar chest that had belonged to Thomas Logan, and pulled out the small black notebook from April 1990. He flipped to the page where his father had sketched the concrete pad beneath the councilman's crusher, his fingers tracing the shaky, handwritten line in the margin. The cement is too fresh under the piston box. Vance won't let the state boys check the lines. She's under the iron. The father had known the truth before his lungs gave out, but he had been trapped in an era where the word of a mill worker carried no currency against the political clout of a city councilman's family line. Michael closed the book, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the window where the cold winter rain was washing the dust from the glass. The arrest warrant for Raymond Vance was executed at 6:45 a.m. by a tactical unit from the State Highway Patrol, their vehicles blocking the long gravel driveway of his brick mansion on the bluff. The old man didn't resist. When the detectives broke down his front door, they found him sitting in his leather armchair in the living room, his silver walker standing beside him, his eyes fixed on the black water of the Ohio River below. He was wearing his old work shirt, his fingers caked with the dry white dust of the hearth, his breathing a shallow, wheezing rattle that filled the clean, expensive room with the scent of an impending biological shutdown. He held out his wrinkled wrists for the handcuffs without saying a single word, his face as flat and expressionless as the concrete pad he had poured 38 years before. The community's reaction was not one of relief, but of a profound, nauseating shock that seemed to destabilize the social structure of the entire valley. The Vance family name had been written into the architecture of Steubenville for 2 generations. They had funded the high school football stadium, sat on the board of the regional hospital, and managed the charities that provided winter coal to the families of the unemployed mill workers. To acknowledge that Raymond Vance was a predator who had hidden a 19-year-old girl beneath his father's machinery was to admit that their entire social order was a lie, a beautifully maintained theater design that had protected a monster from the consequences of a slaughter. The crowds began to gather outside the brick mansion within an hour of the broadcast, their cars lining the shoulders of Route 7 for miles. They were silent, staring up at the bluff with the flat, defensive eyes of people who had been betrayed by their own history. The local merchants who had shared a booth with Raymond at the country club dinners for 30 years suddenly found themselves unable to look at their own children. They realized that every handshake, every business transaction, and every civic celebration had been conducted in the shadow of the car crusher. The suspicion spread outward like an airborne virus, turning neighbors against each other, transforming long-standing friendships into engines of intense doubt and anxiety. If Raymond Vance could look that innocent, if he could play the part of the civic pillar so perfectly while a body was rotting 3 miles from his kitchen, then who else on their quiet streets was carrying a corpse in their foundation? The State Forensic Laboratory in Columbus became the final arena for the verification of the horror. The pathologists worked under high-intensity halogen lamps, their scalpels and forceps moving with a slow, clinical reverence through the greasy remains that had been lifted from the inspection vault. They found the silver initial ring still caked in the hydraulic fluid, its metal surface holding a microscopic cluster of epithelial cells that had been preserved by the anaerobic environment beneath the cement. The DNA extraction was a textbook success, the modern amplification techniques revealing a profile that matched the missing student's 1988 medical records with a mathematical probability of 99.9%. The defense team, hired by Raymond's son with the remaining assets of the family's real estate holdings, tried to launch a sequence of procedural counterattacks. They filed motions to suppress the core sample evidence, claiming that the environmental inspection had been an illegal search conducted without a judicial warrant. They argued that the 38-year gap had contaminated the chain of custody, that the hydraulic fluid had degraded the biological markers, and that the suspect's advanced age and failing health made a fair trial an impossibility under the state constitution. But the science was too loud. It cut through the legal strategies like an industrial torch through sheet metal. The bone was real, the blood was real, and the mechanical imprint on the skull was a permanent signature of the killer's workspace. The trial was scheduled for the first week of August, but everyone in the courthouse knew that the real judgment had already taken place inside the minds of the locals. The cold case was officially closed on the state's computer networks, its digital entry marked with a bold red stamp. Cleared by arrest. The administrative systems had completed their circuit, moving the 19-year-old student from the missing list to the homicide ledger, checking off the blocks, and archiving the old reports into the historical vaults. But the resolution offered no healing to the river basin. The truth had arrived not as a peaceful light, but as a destructive force that had torn the skin off the town, leaving behind a raw, bleeding vacancy that would continue to haunt the lineage of everyone who had ever called that valley home. The machine had been dismantled, the concrete had been crushed, and the old man was behind bars, but the silence of Steubenville remained unbroken, a heavy, holding its breath quiet that would last long after the names were forgotten and the river had completely reclaimed the dirt where the nightmare lived. The administrative machinery of the state of Ohio moves with a slow, grinding weight, but it possesses a terrifying memory when written in the language of forensics. By the second week of April 2026, the temporary yellow tents of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation had been replaced by a more permanent enclosure, a corrugated steel shelter that encapsulated the carcass of the 1980s car crusher like a makeshift tomb. The site was no longer an environmental reclamation project. It was officially designated as Homicide Scene Alpha. The freezing rain of the river basin had turned into a thick, clinging mud that covered the boots of the technicians as they crawled through the lower inspection pit, their movements restricted by the narrow iron framework that had held Raymond Vance's secret for 38 years. The state's digital mapping unit spent 4 days inside the enclosure, using high-density laser scanners to create a three-dimensional, millimetric reconstruction of the subterranean vault. The data that flashed across the monitors in the mobile command center revealed an agonizing truth about the spatial dynamics of the 1988 ambush. The 19-year-old student hadn't simply been dropped into a hole. The space had been physically modified to receive her. The anthropologist's notes, transmitted directly to the district attorney's office in Steubenville, detailed the presence of structural tool marks along the limestone bedrock beneath the concrete cap, grooves caked with ancient lime and anti-corrosive marine primer that matched the heavy chisels found in Raymond Vance's personal tool cabinet. Michael Logan sat in the front seat of his truck, parked outside the chained perimeter fence, the engine idling to keep the defroster running against the damp chill. He had his father's black surveyor's notebook open on his lap, its grease-stained pages fluttering in the draft from the dashboard vents. He was staring at the entry from May 1991, a sketch of the scrap yard's drainage network that his father had drawn by hand after spending a night watching the facility from the ridge above Route 7. The sketch showed a hidden bypass line, a 3-inch copper conduit that connected the car crusher's inspection pit directly to the main culvert that ran beneath the highway and emptied into the Ohio River. The father had written a single, shivering paragraph beneath the diagram. The old man Vance don't run the mixer for a patch job. He's running a line. Every spring when the river rises, The water comes up into the flats, but the pit under the crusher stays bone dry. He's got a pump down there or a valve that lets the grease drain straight into the creek. He ain't fixing the foundation. He's plumbing a grave. Michael closed the book, his knuckles white against the dark leather cover. The realization was a physical nausea that made his chest contract. His father had carried this blueprint of suspicion for 20 years, a useless, unprovable truth that had poisoned his relationships, ruined his health, and turned his family home into a fortress of silent, bitter paranoia because the local sheriff's office had chosen to look the other way. The lead detective on the BCI cold case unit, a veteran investigator named Elena Cruz, spent her evenings in a windowless room at the county courthouse, reading through the original grand jury testimony from the winter of 1989. She was looking for the specific systemic blind spots, the institutional levers that had been pulled to ensure that Raymond Vance was never subjected to a polygraph or a forensic vehicle inspection. The transcripts revealed a complex web of small-town deference and economic leverage. In 1988, Raymond's father, the former councilman, chaired the county's Industrial Development Committee, the body that held the authority to grant tax abatements to the very shipping companies that kept the local deputies employed through off-duty security contracts. Cruz found a deposition from an 18-year-old scrap yard laborer who had worked the night shift on December 13, 1988. The boy had claimed that he saw Raymond Vance washing down the interior bed of a commercial flatbed hauler with a mix of industrial degreaser and hot water at 4 o'clock in the morning, less than 2 hours after the student's sedan was discovered abandoned on Route 7. The deposition had been crossed out with a blue grease pencil, the notation in the margin written by the former sheriff himself. Witness erratic, suspected of narcotics involvement. Alibi of Raymond Vance verified by family members at the residence. The file had been intentionally crippled from the first 48 hours, the truth traded away to protect the political stability of a town that was already bleeding its manufacturing base to death. The emotional infection of the recovery began to spread outward from the salvage yard, hitting the quiet residential streets of the hilltop developments where the town's older families lived. The people who had sat on the church boards with Raymond Vance, who had purchased his restored classic cars, and who had invited him to their daughters' weddings were suddenly forced to look back at their own history through a nightmarish filter. They remembered him standing in the light of the country club patio, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands clean and dry as he passed a cocktail or signed a charitable donation check, while 3 miles away, beneath 10 tons of iron plating, the silver initial ring on a 19-year-old girl's left hand was turning black in a pool of hydraulic fluid. The suspicion turned into a localized economic paralysis. The real estate market in the immediate vicinity of the scrap yard collapsed within a week of the BCI excavation. 2 commercial property sales on the riverfront fell through after the buyers demanded core drilling clauses that the local sellers couldn't provide. The townspeople began to form small, silent crowds on the sidewalk opposite the courthouse, watching the windows of the prosecutor's office with the flat, defensive eyes of people who felt they were being occupied by a foreign army. They didn't want the details, they didn't want the pathology reports. They wanted the trial to be an administrative formality that would allow them to pull their security shutters down and go back to a reality that didn't smell like old lime and decayed calcium. The BCI Forensic Anthropology Laboratory in Columbus released its comprehensive skeletal pathology report on April 18, 2026. Detective Cruz summoned Michael Logan and his sister, Clara, to a private briefing room at the state capitol. The room was sterile, white-walled, and smelled of ozone from the copy machines. Cruz laid out a sequence of high-resolution macro photographs of the victim's cranium, pointing her pen toward the semicircular indentation on the left temple panel. The fracture wasn't caused by a single blow from a handheld weapon, Cruz explained, her voice steady and clinical as she watched the siblings' faces. The metal analysis of the bone margins showed distinct traces of an industrial zinc chromate coating, the exact anti-rust primer used on the heavy locking pins of a 1978 hydraulic car crusher. Your aunt wasn't killed on Route 7. She was forced into a vehicle, brought through the main gate of the yard while the storm was at its peak, and held against the machine's side gate. The pressure that broke her skull was mechanical, a controlled compression designed to incapacitate her before she was dropped into the service pit. He used the structure of his daily workspace as an execution block. Clara didn't look at the photographs. She kept her eyes fixed on her brother's hands, her lips trembling, her fingers gripping her purse until the seams popped. "The bypass pipe," she said, her voice thin and dry like old newsprint. "The one our father sketched in '91. Did you find it?" Cruz reached into her folder and pulled out a secondary set of images, showing a section of the excavation pit where the concrete had been broken away from the limestone foundation wall. Emerging from the dark clay was a corroded, 3-inch copper pipe, its joint secured by an old brass packing nut that had been coated in automotive gasket sealant to prevent leakage. Inside the pipe, the forensic chemists had recovered a mineralized residue that contained trace amounts of decomposed organic matter mixed with the heavy lead-based lubricants used in mid-century hydraulic systems. "The system worked exactly the way your father thought it did," Cruz said softly. Every time the spring thaw flooded the river basin, the hydraulic head pressure would force the groundwater up through the gravel. Raymond Vance didn't just pour concrete over the vault. He built a gravity-fed filtration system. The fluids from the decomposition were systematically leached out of the pit, through the copper line, and into the county sewer main under the highway. He maintained a self-cleaning grave for 38 years. He didn't have to worry about the gas or the moisture breaking through the cement floor because he had plumbed the crime directly into the town's infrastructure. The disclosure was the final, devastating blow to the remaining fragments of the Logan family's history. The father hadn't been a crazy man driven to obsession by a tragic loss. He had been an accurate surveyor who had been gaslit by his own community for 2 decades. The childhood Michael and Clara remembered, the long, silent drives along the river road, the father's sudden, violent outbursts every time the Vance name appeared on a billboard or a newspaper headline, wasn't a domestic tragedy born of grief. It was the slow-motion psychological execution of a man who knew the identity of a killer but was forced to live in a town that preferred the convenience of a lie. The legal reality of the case, however, was rapidly hardening into an administrative nightmare for the state prosecutors. Raymond Vance's defense team, financed by a private trust fund that had been established before the liquidation of his father's estate, filed a 100-page motion to dismiss the indictment on April 22. They argued that the suspect's medical profile, specifically an advanced stage of vascular dementia and a recent cardiac insufficiency, render him incompetent to stand trial under the Due Process Clause of the Ohio Constitution. They brought in high-priced neurological experts from Cleveland who testified that Raymond Vance's brain scans showed a total dissolution of his short-term memory, that he couldn't identify his own lawyers, and that his deathbed statement to the arresting officers was nothing more than a transient confessional fantasy induced by his hypoxia. The state had its body, it had its DNA match, it had the mechanical signature on the skull, but its target was a hollow shell that didn't know what year it was. The system was running its gears in an empty room, the legal definitions of accountability and justice dissolving into the sterile terminology of geriatric medicine. Detective Cruz spent her nights at the precinct, staring at the red lines on her chronology chart, realizing that the old man had outrun the calendar. He had lived his life, spent his money, enjoyed his status, and now his own neurological decay was acting as a final, unbreakable shield against the prison cell that had been waiting for him since December 1988. The property on Route 7 was officially abandoned by the County Land Bank in late May, its title transferred to a state-managed corporate shell that was designed to hold toxic industrial sites until they could be cleared by federal funds. The order for the total demolition of the remaining scrap yard structures was signed by a county judge on a rainy Tuesday morning, 38 years and 5 months after the 19-year-old student's shoe was found in the slush on the highway shoulder. The date for the final clearance was set for a Thursday, the same day of the week the initial search party had broken up in the snow without finding a single trace of her life. Michael Logan and his sister didn't speak to each other as they stood on the public right-of-way outside the chain-link fence on the morning of the demolition. The sky was a heavy, slate-gray sheet that hovered low over the river basin, the smell of coal smoke and wet iron filling the air as the 2 large yellow excavators pulled onto the concrete pad. A small group of local residents had gathered near the highway marker, their coats zipped to their chins, their faces solemn and unreadable as they watched the steel teeth of the machines lift toward the heavy iron gantry of the old car crusher. The operator of the lead machine engaged the hydraulic pumps, and the massive iron bucket swung forward with a heavy, metallic shriek that echoed across the water. The steel jaws struck the upper cylinder housing first, the old iron plates buckling with a sound like a small artillery shell exploding, sending a shower of rusted scale and black waxy grease into the mud below. The crowd on the sidewalk didn't move. No one spoke. The excavators worked with a brutal, indifferent momentum, tearing away the crane tracks, crushing the old office shacks where the councilman had signed his checks, and flattening the perimeter walls until the entire 5-acre site was a uniform landscape of broken brick and twisted cable. When the machine reached the concrete stabilizing pad beneath the crusher, the bucket dug deep into the hand-mixed aggregate layer that Raymond Vance had poured in 1988. The hydraulics of the excavator hissed under the strain, the metal teeth grooving the cement until it fractured into 3 massive, jagged chunks that were lifted out of the pit like broken teeth from a jaw. The underground inspection vault was exposed to the daylight for the first time in 38 years, its interior walls lined with rotted timber that instant crumpled into black dust under the air. The 3-inch copper bypass line was ripped out of the limestone bedrock, its brass packing net spinning through the mud before landing at the base of Michael Logan's boots. He didn't bend down to pick it up. He kept his hands crammed into his pockets, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the machine had stood, his face white and stone-still under the gray rain. He knew that the destruction of the yard hadn't resolved anything. It had simply cleared the geography of the evidence. The cold case was off the active ledgers, the data points checked off, the paperwork moved to the historical vaults in Columbus, but the secret confession was still vibrating in his veins, an active inheritance of trauma that would continue to define every second of his remaining life. The trucks arrived to haul the rubble away to a high-security industrial landfill near the state line, their beds covered in heavy black tarpaulins to prevent the toxic dust from escaping into the air of the highway. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the yard was a flat, empty expanse of gray gravel and wet clay that looked like an unhealed scar on the face of the river basin. The excavators pulled onto their transport trailers and drove away, their tires leaving thick black ribbons of mud on the asphalt of Route 7 that would stay frozen until the following spring. Clara walked toward her car, her head down, her coat collar turned up against the wind that was screaming off the water. She didn't look back at her brother, who remained standing by the fence line, a solitary figure in a heavy winter coat whose identity had been completely consumed by the excavation of his father's suspicion. They were the children of a cold case, their past severed from any conventional sense of safety or home, their family line permanently marked by the engineering precision of a 3-decade-old murder scene that had been plumbed directly into the heart of the town they called home. The silence of Steubenville returned, heavy, cold, and absolute, a permanent atmosphere that would hang over the river road long after the names were forgotten and the dark Ohio clay had completely reclaimed the void where the nightmare used to live. The settlement of the soil within the perimeter of Homicide Scene Alpha was a silent, geometric process that mocked the frantic speed of human calculations. By June 2026, the corrugated steel enclosure that had encapsulated the old 1980s car crusher was gone, dismantled by the same state-contracted demolition crews that had flattened the remaining infrastructure of the Vance family line. What remained was a raw, rectangular basin of exposed limestone and dark river clay, its borders lined by the jagged teeth of the broken foundation walls. The summer heat had arrived early in the Ohio River Valley, turning the mud into a cracked, white crust that smelled of high-density hydrocarbons and the ancient, alkaline lime that had been trapped beneath the concrete pad since December 1988. For Detective Elena Cruz, the physical clearance of the scrap yard did not signal a return to the routine administration of the cold case unit. She spent her days in her office at the BCI headquarters in Columbus, a room that had become an archive of specialized industrial data. Her desk was a landscape of metallurgical analyses, hydraulic pump schematics from the late 1970s, and multispectral satellite imagery of Route 7 that traced the seasonal shifts in vegetation over 4 decades. She had realized that the traditional methodologies of interrogation and suspect elimination were completely obsolete in this theater of violence. She wasn't investigating a standard criminal act, but a long-term engineering project that had used the geography of the town as its primary containment system. She found herself hyper-focusing on the final report from the State Metallurgy Laboratory, a document that detailed the molecular structure of the 3-inch copper bypass pipe that had drained the inspection vault. The analysis revealed that the copper had been treated with an internal zinc phosphate wash, a high-grade industrial anti-fouling compound used in the cooling systems of the steel mill blast furnaces. Raymond Vance hadn't simply found a piece of scrap pipe in his father's yard. He had stolen a precision-engineered chemical conduit from the Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel Complex during his brief employment there as a millwright in 1986. The internal wash had prevented the calcium deposits and organic fats from sticking to the walls of the line, ensuring that the gravity-fed filtration system would continue to operate at peak efficiency during the high-pressure surges of the spring floods without ever backing up into the basement of the workshop. The level of meticulous forethought written into the metal was a diagnostic indicator of a specific kind of Midwestern madness, a calculated, manual precision that values the structural durability of a lie over any concept of human survival. Raymond Vance hadn't lived in fear of detection. He had managed his secret like a plant foreman supervising a long-term production schedule. He had integrated his crimes so deeply into the industrial plumbing of the river basin that the decay of his victim became a routine function of the county's wastewater network. Every gallon of spring water that leached through the limestone bedrock and out into the creek was a ledger entry he had already balanced in his mind before the first search party ever gathered in the snow on Route 7. The daughter of the surveyor, Clara Logan, had retreated into an environment of total domestic anonymity in her small brick home in Zanesville. She had spent the weeks following the BCI briefing moving her furniture out of her living room, stacking the chairs and tables in the garage until her house resembled a storage facility, a series of clean, white-walled spaces that held nothing but the bare essentials of survival. She had disconnected the main telephone line, ignored the registered mail from the county probate court, and spent her evenings sitting on a wooden stool by the kitchen window, watching the long-haul semi-trucks move across the distant interstate overpass. She felt a profound, physical revulsion toward any object that possessed a history, any piece of wood or fabric that could hold a memory or an unspoken secret from her family line. She was interrupted on a Tuesday evening by her brother, Michael, who entered the kitchen without knocking, his boots leaving thick smears of dark Steubenville clay across the clean linoleum floor. He looked like a man who had spent months living out of his vehicle. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his canvas jacket stained with the greasy soot of the River Road refineries. He didn't speak to his sister, nor did he offer any greeting. He walked straight to the table and placed his father's black surveyor's notebook on the wood, its pages now swollen with moisture and caked with the gray gravel of the scrap yard basin. "It's not over, Clara," Michael said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used for conversation in weeks. "The state prosecutors are going to let him go. I sat in the courtroom in Steubenville today during the competency hearing. The old man Vance didn't even know his own name. He had a piece of medical plastic taped to his arm, and he spent 2 hours trying to catch the dust motes in the air with his fingers. His lawyers brought in 3 different doctors from Cleveland who testified that his brain has been completely hollowed out by the vascular dementia. They're moving him out of the county jail and into a private psychiatric sanitarium near Toledo. There won't be a trial. There won't be a verdict. The judge is going to sign an order of permanent administrative deferral before the month is out." Clara didn't look at the notebook. She kept her eyes fixed on the clean, white surface of the kitchen counter, her hands folded tight in her lap to stop her fingers from shaking. The news of the legal impasse didn't strike her as an injustice. It felt like a final, mocking demonstration of the Vance family's total immunity from the laws of the town. Raymond Vance hadn't just outmaneuvered the original investigators in 1988. His own neurological decay had now outmaneuvered the modern forensic state, turning his brain into an unbreakable safe that had dissolved the key before the prosecutors could ever fit it into the lock. He had used his life, spent his money, enjoyed his country club dinners, and now his body was surrendering its consciousness to protect him from the prison cell that had been waiting for him for 38 years. "We need to burn the books, Michael," Clara whispered, her voice thin and sharp like a razor blade cutting through linen. "We need to take everything our father wrote everything he sketched and put it in the incinerator behind the garage. It didn't save her. It didn't help the police. It just turned our father into a ghost that lived in our house, a crazy man who spent 20 years staring through binoculars at an iron machine while his own children were afraid to walk down the cellar steps. The Van Cess won. They won on the night the concrete was poured, and they won today in that courtroom. There's nothing left for us to negotiate but the size of our own wreckage. Michael reached down and gripped the edges of the surveyor's book, his knuckles turning a bloodless, ivory white against the dark leather cover. "I can't burn it, Clara," he said, his chest heaving with a sudden, dangerous intensity. "If I burn the book, then our father was just a lunatic who died in a clinic for nothing. The town wants us to burn it. The city council wants the medical lab built over that lot, so they can pretend that 1988 was just a bad dream that was settled by a digital DNA report. The plumbing is still there, Clara. The copper line is still embedded in the limestone bedrock beneath the highway. The excavators couldn't pull it out without shutting down Route 7. Every time it rains, the water still flows through that pipe. The machine is gone, but the grave is still connected to the town." He turned, slammed the kitchen door behind him, and walked back out into the humid summer night, his truck engine starting with a loud, mechanical roar that rattled the windows of her quiet street before he disappeared into the dark. Clara sat on her stool until the sun began to rise over the Zanesville hills, the pale, yellow light illuminating the smears of mud her brother had left on the floorboards. She realized that the infection of the cold case didn't stop with the death of the suspects or the recovery of the remains. It was a hereditary current that ran through their bloodline, transforming each generation into a set of watchmen who were condemned to guard a vacancy, their lives completely defined by the geometry of an ancient murder scene that they could neither avenge nor forget. Back in Steubenville, the impact of the BCI excavation had entered a phase of institutional containment. The county commissioners had formally approved the fast-tracked sale of the empty lot to a regional logistics firm that intended to pave the 5-acre site with 6 inches of industrial asphalt to create a terminal for heavy freight haulers moving chemical compounds from the riverfront plants. The local newspapers had stopped printing the name of the 19-year-old student, replacing the investigative updates with articles on the economic revitalization of the River Road corridor. The town was performing an act of collective surgery on its own memory, cutting away the 1988 timeline to ensure that the reputation of its prominent civic families remained unblemished by the stench of the scrapyard basin. Detective Cruz visited homicide scene Alpha one final time before her administrative transfer back to the Major Crimes Division in Columbus. The afternoon was dying, the sky a heavy, purple sheet of cloud that pressed down on the rusted smokestacks of the industrial outskirts. She parked her BCI utility van on the shoulder of Route 7, leaving the engine running, her boots sinking into the dry, weed-choked gravel of the public right-of-way as she walked toward the chain-link perimeter fence. The ground within the fence had begun to settle, the dry clay sinking into a shallow, uniform depression where the subterranean inspection pit had been carved out of the limestone bedrock. A small puddle of black, stagnant rainwater had collected in the center of the void, its surface covered in a thin, iridescent film of old hydraulic oil that had floated up from the deep cracks in the stone. Cruz looked down at the oil, her mind running through the logistics of the crime one final time: the stolen blast furnace pipe, the zinc phosphate wash, the hand-mixed aggregate layer that had balanced the aggregate to prevent the cap from sweating. She realized that the true horror of the case wasn't that Raymond Vance had escaped a prison sentence through the intervention of his dementia. The horror was that his architecture of concealment had been completely successful. He had lived his life exactly the way he wanted to, surrounded by the respect of his community, while the infrastructure of the town itself acted as his accomplice, cleaning his grave every spring for 38 years while the neighbors mowed their lawns and watched their children grow up. The intervention of modern forensic science wasn't a triumph of justice. It was a transient administrative correction, a series of data points updated in a computer mainframe in Columbus, leaving the moral universe of the River Valley completely unbalanced. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her personal BCI identification badge, the heavy, silver shield she had carried into the basement workshops and the archive vaults, and held it against the frozen wire of the fence. She didn't drop it into the mud. She didn't leave a marker. She simply stood there in the dark, a silent servant of an imperfect system, listening to the high-pressure hiss of the semi-truck brakes on the highway behind her. She knew that the cold case was closed on the ledgers, but the haunting of Steubenville would remain active in the marrow of its children, a low-frequency vibration of doubt that would keep them double-checking their locks, watching the shadows in their cellars, and wondering about the true dimensions of the concrete foundations beneath their own homes. She turned her back on the empty basin, got into her van, and drove away into the gray Ohio evening, her taillights disappearing into the industrial fog within seconds, leaving Route 7 to its eternal, unacknowledged silence under the cold summer stars. The asphalt that eventually covered the empty basin of the old Vance salvage yard was mixed with a high-density industrial aggregate designed to bear the maximum wheel load of 20-ton chemical tankers. By late June 2026, the county engineering department had completed the grading of Route 7's perimeter, smoothing out the deep, jagged ruts left behind by the Bureau of Criminal Investigation's mobile units. To a casual driver heading north toward Youngstown, the site appeared to be nothing more than a sterile, uncharacterizable corporate staging area, a flat sheet of black tar surrounded by a newly galvanized security fence that gleamed under the heavy, humid Midwestern sun. The town had achieved its administrative objective. The timber had been hauled to a regulated landfill, the limestone bedrock had been resealed, and the physical footprint of the 1980s car crusher had been completely erased from the local geography. Yet, the elimination of the physical structure did not purge the air of the valley. A vacancy in a manicured suburb carries its own quiet tension, but a massive, black-topped void squeezed between an industrial river and a state highway operates as an environmental lens, focusing the attention of every local resident on the exact coordinate where a human life was systematically compressed. The silence along that specific stretch of Route 7 was no longer the peaceful quiet of an empty river basin. It was a heavy, holding its breath stillness, the kind of static atmospheric pressure that precedes a violent summer thunderstorm. The community had tried to use the asphalt as an eraser, but the memory of the 38-year deception remained caked in the mud of the ditches, an invisible current that refused to be paved over by the city council's economic revitalization grants. For Detective Elena Cruz, the formal signing of the administrative clearance forms at the BCI headquarters in Columbus offered no sense of professional transition. She had spent her career in an environment dictated by linear logic: the search, the recovery, the forensic match, and the judicial resolution. But the Steubenville file had encountered a biological dead end that the legal code of the state of Ohio was never designed to navigate. The suspect was currently sitting in a private, high-security medical sanitarium near Toledo, his brain a clean, white landscape of advanced cortical atrophy that had systematically unmade his memory long before the state's prosecutors could ever read him his rights. He didn't know why his hands were caked with the phantom dust of old lime. He didn't recognize the name of the girl whose initial ring had been recovered from his father's inspection pit. He was a living archive that had destroyed its own index. Cruz spent her mornings in the records room of the state capitol, reviewing the auxiliary field notes that had been filed away during the final week of the excavation. She was searching for the historical residues, the secondary points of impact that had been omitted from the official press releases to protect the institutional reputation of the county. She discovered a sequence of old municipal water department maintenance logs from the spring of 1993, logs that had been flagged as non-correlative by the previous administration. The field technicians of the era had noted a persistent, highly irregular spike in the biochemical oxygen demand within the main drainage culvert directly beneath the Vance property, a biological anomaly that always peaked during the second week of April, immediately after the high-pressure river surges subsided. The log showed that the water department had issued 3 separate administrative warnings to the councilman's business office, requesting an internal inspection of the facility's grease traps and subterranean drainage valves. Every single warning had been crossed out with a red wax pencil, accompanied by a handwritten notation from the county safety director. Issue resolved through private maintenance. No further municipal inspection required. Vance estate cleared of environmental liability. The mechanism of the concealment had been protected by the regulatory architecture of the town itself, a system of small-town balances and mutual political immunities that had treated the decomposition of a 19-year-old student as a minor sewer maintenance problem that could be traded away for a campaign contribution or a favorable vote on a zoning variance. The daughter of the surveyor, Clara Logan, had entered a state of absolute, geometric isolation inside her bare house in Zanesville. The heat of the Ohio summer had turned her unfurnished rooms into white, stifling boxes that held nothing but the glare of the afternoon sun and the dry, rhythmic clicking of the electricity meter on the back porch. She had stopped buying newspapers, she had disconnected her television, and she had spent her days sitting on a low wooden bench near the cold fireplace, her fingers trace-playing the smooth, unvarnished pine of the floorboards. She had achieved a state of sensory neutrality that was designed to protect her from the memory of her brother's voice, from the greasy scent of the Steubenville mud, and from the terrifying clarity of her father's hand-drawn maps. She was interrupted on a Thursday afternoon by a delivery courier, a young man in an orange utility shirt who carried a heavy, cardboard tube sealed with reinforced plastic tape. The package had been forwarded to her address by the clerk of the municipal court in Steubenville, its label bearing the official stamp of the County Land Bank Liquidation Division. Clara didn't open the tube inside her kitchen. She walked out to the small concrete patio behind her garage, using a kitchen knife to cut through the heavy seals under the blinding light of the midday sky. Inside the tube was a single, high-resolution architectural plot, a map of the newly designed occupational health laboratory that was scheduled to be constructed on the Elmwood Drive lot by the end of the year. The blueprint showed the alignment of the new steel foundation piers, the placement of the underground drainage cisterns, and the exact coordinates where the main utility trench would cut through the property lines. Someone in the county planning office, perhaps an old colleague of her father who still carried a lingering sense of guilt, had used a yellow highlighter to mark a specific point on the map, the exact coordinate where the copper bypass line from Raymond Vance's inspection pit intersected with the municipal sewer main beneath the blacktop of Route 7. A small, handwritten note was pinned to the margin of the plot, the ink fresh and dark against the white paper. The excavators couldn't pull the copper line without breaking the high-pressure water main for the whole North District. The commercial developer has agreed to encase the pipe in 3 feet of solid industrial concrete before they lay the asphalt for the parking lot. The line stays where it is, Clara. It's part of the street now. Clara held the blueprint over the metal trash can she used for burning yard waste, struck a heavy strike-anywhere match against the brickwork of the patio, and watched the yellow, highlighted lines catch fire. The paper burned with a fierce, chemical green flame, the heat distorting the architectural diagrams until the names of the streets and the numbers of the sections ran together into a black, bubbling crust of ash. She didn't feel any anger. She didn't feel any sorrow. She stood there in the humid air, watching the smoke rise toward the sycamore trees, realizing that her father's obsession had been entirely accurate, but completely useless. The town hadn't just protected the killer during his life. They were now integrating his plumbing into the permanent infrastructure of the modern county, transforming a murder scene into a structural component of the local economy. The brother, Michael, had dropped out of the family's geographic network entirely. He had left his apartment in Cleveland, abandoned his position at the engineering firm, and spent his weeks moving along the rural river roads that connected Steubenville to the old coal towns of West Virginia. His truck had become a mobile archive of his father's suspicion. The passenger seat was piled high with old survey markers, rolls of heavy drafting film, and the remaining volumes of the county property deeds from the late 1980s. He had become a ghost in his own lineage, his face lined by the constant exposure to the river fog and the dry, chemical dust of the gravel pits he spent his nights investigating. He had developed a specific, mechanical ritual that he executed every Tuesday at midnight. He would park his truck on the public right-of-way outside the new fence line of Homicide Scene Alpha, his headlights turned off, his windows rolled down to let the heavy, sulfur-scented air of the riverfront fill the cabin. He would sit with his stopwatch in his hand, listening to the rhythmic chug of the high-pressure drainage pumps that the logistics terminal had installed to keep the new asphalt from buckling during the summer flash floods. He was calculating the cycle rate of the water, matching the sound of the pumps against the old formulas his father had written in the black surveyor's notebook in May 1991. He knew his mind was operating under a dangerous, localized friction, that his nervous system was keeping watch over a target that had already been destroyed by the state's machines. But he couldn't break the loop. Every time the heavy pumps engaged, their low, metallic growl felt like a direct transmission from his father's grave, a mechanical verification that the debt had never been paid, that the truth had been caught in the filters of the legal system and reduced to an administrative compromise that let the killer die in a clean bed with white sheets. He wasn't looking for revenge anymore. He was looking for a logical exit from his own memory, an engineering equation that would allow him to drop the books and let the river have the rest of his life. The sanitarium near Toledo where Raymond Vance was being held sat on a flat, windswept ridge overlooking the old drainage canals of the Maumee River Basin. It was a facility of absolute, clinical anonymity, a series of low, single-story concrete buildings surrounded by manicured lawns and high-security fences that looked like a modern suburban office park. The old man spent his days in a wheelchair by the day-room window, his face smooth and unlined, his white hair cropped close to his skull by the facility's staff. He had achieved a state of total, biological insulation from the history he had manufactured. His blood pressure was normal, his heart rate was steady, and his eyes were clear, glassy discs that reflected the passing of the cloud shadows across the flat grass without a single trace of recognition or remorse. When his son, the real estate developer who had funded the legal defense, came to visit him on a Saturday afternoon, the old man didn't look up from his hands. The son sat in the vinyl chair opposite the window, his expensive leather briefcase resting on his knees, his face pale and tight under the harsh fluorescent glare of the ceiling tiles. He had spent the morning signing the final liquidation papers for his father's estate, papers that transferred the remaining titles of their Steubenville properties to the State Land Bank to satisfy the priority tax liens generated by the forensic excavation. "The shop is gone, Dad," the son said, his voice dropping to a low, flat murmur that didn't travel past the edge of the window frame. "They paved over the whole yard last week. There's nothing left down there but the fence and the asphalt. The lawyers said the BCI files are officially closed. There won't be any more hearings. There won't be any more news crews at the house. It's over." The old man didn't respond. He didn't blink. He reached out with a trembling, liver-spotted hand and picked a single piece of lint off the cuff of his gray sweatpants, his fingers moving with an immense, slow-motion precision that looked exactly like the way he used to adjust the hydraulic valves on the car crusher's control panel. He held the thread up to the light, studied it for 3 seconds with a cold, incurious intensity, and then let the wind from the ventilation duct blow it out of his palm. He had outlived the victim, he had outlived the investigators, and he had outlived his own mind, leaving a son to carry the economic and psychological weight of the slaughter while he drifted into the total, unblemished protection of his own medical chart. Back in the suburb, the institutional stabilization was total. The regional logistics hub had begun operations on the old salvage yard site, its security guards patrolling the asphalt perimeter with large flashlights, their eyes fixed on the chemical haulers that lined up along Route 7 every morning at dawn. The new residents of the hilltop developments walked their dogs past the galvanized fence, their faces turned toward the river, entirely insulated from the knowledge that 3 feet beneath the black tar of the parking spaces sat the copper nerve that had cleaned a grave for 38 years. The town had reestablished its order, its lawns were mowed, its taxes were collected, and its secrets were safely encased in 3 feet of solid industrial concrete, a permanent monument to a cold case that had been resolved by science, but integrated into the very foundation of the life they called home. The arrival of July 2026 brought a thick, industrial haze to the Jefferson County Basin, a suffocating blanket of moisture and ozone that trapped the scent of coal tar and river silt against the valley floor. On Route 7, the newly laid black asphalt of the logistics staging area softened under the relentless 90-degree heat, its dark, tarred surface bubbling slightly along the margins where the galvanized security fence met the gravel ditch. The physical transformation of the space was absolute. There were no more rusted crane tracks, no more collapsing equipment sheds, and no more yellow crime scene tape fluttering from the briars. The landscape had been completely flattened, re-engineered, and converted into a sterile asset for the commercial corridor. Yet, the emptiness of that 5-acre expanse possessed a strange, heavy mass, a silent, vibrating frequency that seemed to radiate from the ground itself, charging the humid air with a low-grade current of unresolved history. Detective Elena Cruz spent her final weeks before her administrative transfer to the Federal Cold Case Task Force sitting in her small, temporary office at the county courthouse. The room was a pressurized cell of silence amidst the chaotic bureaucracy of the building, its walls lined with the cardboard boxes that held the redundant copies of the 1988 Master Ledger. She had officially signed off on the clearance memorandum, entering the digital codes that changed the status of the file from active investigation to resolved by identification. On the state servers in Columbus, the case was considered a closed loop, an archive of physical facts that had been successfully harvested, cataloged, and stored away in the historical vaults. But Cruz knew that the digital code was an administrative fiction. The investigation hadn't resolved the trauma of the River Valley. It had simply stripped the mystery of its camouflage, leaving the raw, bleeding mechanics of the crime completely exposed to a community that didn't have the stomach to look at them. She spent her afternoons reviewing the metallurgical data from the copper bypass pipe, her eyes tracing the high-resolution microscopic photographs of the internal zinc phosphate coating. The science was beautiful, clean, and utterly devastating. The anti-fouling wash had done its job with an almost terrifying durability. Even after 38 years of continuous exposure to the acidic groundwater and organic fats of the subterranean inspection vault, the metal had retained its non-porous integrity, preventing any internal blockages that would have caused the grave to back up or sweat through the concrete pad above. Raymond Vance had built a machine that outlasted the factories, outlasted the political careers of his family line, and outlasted the very cells of his own brain. The sheer, manual competence written into the plumbing was a monument to a specific brand of Midwestern pragmatism, an architecture that values the physical survival of a structure over any moral contract with the living. Cruz pulled her small, leather-bound notebook from her jacket pocket, turning to the entries she had written during the initial excavation in March. She had interviewed an old secretary who had worked in the councilman's office from 1985 to 1992, an elderly woman who now lived in a nursing home overlooking the river locks. The log was short, the ink slightly faded by the moisture of the valley. Witness states Raymond kept a secondary set of ledger books in his workshop, not for the scrap totals, but for the municipal concrete orders. Said he would check the rain gauges every morning at 5, matching the water level in the creek against the thickness of the cellar pad. Said he called it managing the aggregate. The phrase returned to Cruz now like a persistent, low-frequency hum. The killer hadn't spent his life in a state of hypervigilant terror or paralyzed remorse. He had operated the crime like a utility, matching his maintenance schedule to the seasonal flow of the Ohio River Basin, completely detached from the human value of the calcium that was draining through his copper pipe. The daughter of the surveyor, Clara Logan, had entered a state of absolute, geometric isolation inside her bare house in Zanesville. The summer heat had turned her empty rooms into white, stifling boxes that held nothing but the rhythmic, dry clicking of the electric fan she had set on the kitchen floorboards. She had severed her connection to the local church. She had refused to answer the calls from her aunts in West Virginia, and she had spent her days sitting on a low wooden bench by the cold hearth, her eyes fixed on the blank plaster wall opposite the window. She had achieved a state of sensory neutrality that was designed to protect her from the memory of her brother's voice, from the greasy scent of the Steubenville mud, and from the terrifying clarity of her father's hand-drawn maps. She had cut away the roots of her identity until she was nothing more than an anonymous tenant waiting for the calendar to run out. She was startled on a Friday afternoon by a sharp, aggressive knock on her front door. It wasn't the delivery courier or the tax representative. It was her brother's wife, a woman named Martha, whom she hadn't seen since the pretrial hearings in Steubenville 2 months before. Martha stood in the drafty hallway, her expensive linen suit looking entirely out of place against the peeling paint of the small house, her face pale, drawn, and caked with a thin film of sweat from the drive. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past Clara into the empty living room, her eyes widening as she noted the total lack of furniture and the single wooden bench sitting near the cold fireplace. "He's gone, Clara," Martha said, her voice a flat, dry whisper that seemed to absorb the ambient light in the room. "Michael hasn't been back to the apartment in Cleveland since Tuesday. He didn't show up for his shift at the engineering firm, and his supervisor said he cleared out his desk weeks ago, leaving his credentials and his security keys on the blotter. The State Highway Patrol found his truck this morning. It was parked on the public right-of-way outside the new fence line of the staging area on Route 7. The keys were in the ignition, the battery was dead, and our father's black surveyor's notebooks were piled on the passenger seat, caked in the dust from the gravel pit. They think he walked into the river, but the dive teams haven't found anything but old slag and timber. He's vanished, Clara. He's dropped straight out of the world." Clara didn't move. She stood by the window, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her denim skirt, her face an unreadable mask under the white glare of the summer sun. The news of her brother's disappearance didn't strike her as a tragedy or a surprise. It felt like a logical, structural progression, the next necessary phase of the collapse that had begun when their father's notebooks were dragged into the light. Michael hadn't been able to survive the engineering precision of the truth. He had spent his professional life building structures based on the absolute certainty of mathematical formulas, and the discovery that his family line had been built on top of a beautifully maintained self-cleaning grave had broken his internal mechanisms. He hadn't fled from the shame. He had fled from the clarity. He had walked into the black water of the river because it was the only space big enough to drown the noise of the hydraulic pumps that had been running in his head since March. "He's not coming back, Martha," Clara said, her voice flat and steady, entirely devoid of the emotional cadence that her sister-in-law was looking for. "He wouldn't come here, and he wouldn't go back to Cleveland. There's nothing left for him to calculate. The machines have flattened the yard, the concrete has been poured over the lines, and the files are closed in Columbus. He's finished his father's survey. He's left the books where they belong, on the shoulder of the road, next to the ghost." Martha began to cry, a loud, ragged sound that filled the empty, echoing room with a sudden, suffocating intimacy. She grabbed Clara's shoulders, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of the canvas jacket with a desperate, territorial force. "How can you be like this?" she screamed, her face inches from Clara's. "That was your brother. That was my husband. Your father didn't just destroy the Van Cess when he kept those notes. He killed both of you. He left a rot in your blood, and you're just sitting here in the dark letting it eat you alive until you're as cold as the bones they dug out of that pit." Clara let her hands stay in her pockets. She didn't try to pull away from Martha's grip. She simply waited for the kinetic energy of the woman's rage to run its course against her own neutrality. She looked into Martha's eyes and saw the perspective of the world outside the fence, the world that believed that an apocalypse could be managed by grief, that a family lineage could be repaired by a court verdict or a change of scenery. They didn't understand the physical reality of the foundation. They didn't know that once the concrete is broken under a house, the structural integrity of every room above is permanently compromised. You cannot build a clean life using the timber from an execution block. You can only let the structure slide into the void until the ground is flat again. "You should go back to Cleveland, Martha," Clara said softly, her breath a faint, warm vapor in the stifling air of the room. "File the missing persons report with the sheriff. Talk to the bank about the mortgage. Don't look for him along the river road, and don't come back to this house. There's nothing in these rooms but an empty space where a family used to pretend they were alive." Martha backed away, her face twisting into an expression of profound disgust and horror, as if she were looking at a casualty who had survived the blast but had lost her humanity in the smoke. She turned, ran down the narrow hallway, her heels slamming against the pine floorboards until the heavy front door of the bungalow slammed shut behind her, leaving the house to its long, geometric silence. Clara walked back to the window, her fingers tracing the frame, her mind completely empty of everything but the distant, rhythmic rumble of the diesel locomotives moving across the Zanesville rail yards, a mechanical sound that carried no secrets, no lineage, and no memories within its iron frame. The copies of the field notes that Michael Logan had left on the passenger seat of his abandoned truck were processed by the local county sheriff's office as non-evidentiary property, their pages logged into a manila envelope that was set on a shelf in the precinct's basement storage locker. The original books, the ones caked with the gray aggregate dust of homicide scene alpha, were never read by the young deputies who handled the vehicle recovery. To them, the handwritten formulas, the sketches of the copper bypass valves, and the cross-referenced rain charts were nothing more than the technical debris of an obsessed surveyor who had suffered a psychological break on the highway shoulder. The case existed only as a closed entry in their digital terminal, a line of data that had reached its bureaucratic destination, leaving the human fallout of the lineage to dissolve into the landscape without a single footnote in the public record. The commercial logistics terminal on Route 7 began full operations in the third week of July. Every morning at dawn, the heavy, 20-ton chemical tankers would line up along the new security fence, their diesel engines idling with a low, vibrating roar that shook the leaves of the sycamore trees that still stood along the riverbank. The security guards, dressed in uniform black utility shirts, patrolled the perimeter with large flashlights, their eyes fixed on the asphalt to ensure that the heavy loads didn't crack the newly sealed surface. The transition was complete. The town had re-established its order, its taxes were being collected, its commerce was moving across the state line, and its 38-year-old horror had been safely encased beneath 3 feet of solid industrial concrete, a permanent, unmarketable monument to a cold case that had been solved by science, but integrated directly into the infrastructure of the life they called home. Detective Cruz walked out of the Steubenville courthouse for the final time on a Tuesday evening, her cardboard files loaded into the back of her BCI utility vehicle. The afternoon was dying, the sky a bruised, purple sheet of cloud that pressed down on the rusted smokestacks of the industrial fringe. She didn't turn toward the interstate. She drove her van slowly down Route 7, pulling onto the gravel shoulder directly opposite the galvanized gates of the logistics facility. She left the engine running, the headlights cutting through the heavy river fog that had begun to rise from the water, filling the ditches with a thick, yellow mist that smelled of wet coal dust and old iron. She got out of the van, her boots crunching on the brittle stone of the right-of-way as she walked toward the chain-link fence. The ground within the perimeter had settled into a uniform, smooth expanse of dark asphalt that reflected the weak amber glow of the highway lights like a black mirror. Cruz looked down at the surface, her mind running through the logistics of the crime one final time. The stolen blast furnace pipe, the zinc phosphate wash, the hand-mixed aggregate layer that had balanced the concrete to ensure that the cap would never sweat. She realized that the true horror of the case wasn't that Raymond Vance had escaped a prison cell through the intervention of his cortical atrophy. The horror was that his architecture of concealment had been completely successful. He had lived his life exactly the way he wanted to, surrounded by the respect of his community, while the infrastructure of the town itself acted as his primary accessory, cleaning his grave every spring for 38 years while the neighbors mowed their lawns and watched their children grow up. The intervention of modern forensic science wasn't a triumph of the law. It was a transient administrative correction, a sequence of numbers updated in a mainframe server in Columbus, leaving the moral universe of the River Valley completely unbalanced. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her personal key ring, and stared at the small, brass tag that held her old office locker number. She didn't drop it into the ditch. She didn't leave a marker. She simply stood there in the humid air, a silent servant of an imperfect system, listening to the high-pressure hiss of the commercial truck brakes on the highway behind her. She knew that the cold case was dead on the ledgers, but the haunting of Steubenville would remain active in the blood of its children, a low-frequency vibration of doubt that would keep them double-checking their locks, watching the shadows in their cellars, and wondering about the true dimensions of the foundations beneath their own homes. She turned her back on the empty blacktop, got into her van, and drove away into the gray Ohio evening, her taillights disappearing into the industrial fog within seconds, leaving Route 7 to its eternal, unacknowledged silence under the cold summer stars.